A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're talking faith and politics today, and after a great conversation there with Christopher Brohier from the Australian Christian Lobby, just highlighting some of the issues that Australians are facing all around Australia. Well, you might have your own insights to offer as we continue a conversation about faith and politics over this coming hour. You might know that this is an election season that we're in. There's some coming elections in the Northern Territory. Territorians are off to the polls on the 24th of August. Then the ACT's turn on the 19th of October. Then the Queensland state election is a week later on the 26th of October. So a special focus today on the state of Queensland with a long-serving MP whose Christian faith has long been a guiding light for his own deliberations, debates and decisions. Dr. Mark Robinson is our guest over this next hour, first elected in the southeast Queensland electorate of Oodgeroo. I don't think it was called Oodgeroo back then, but in 2009 he was elected to a state member's seat in Queensland. But he's not going to be recontesting his Cleveland-based seat at the coming election, and we might get a chance to talk about this too, but former Senator Amanda Stoker is the endorsed candidate and hoping to make a political comeback. Retiring Queensland MP, and I imagine that's what he calls himself, Dr. Mark Robinson, and a few little details, married with 7 children, and has often been criticised as an advocate for mainstream and traditional family values. He's a former Deputy Speaker in the Queensland Parliament, and he's served as a member of the Parliamentary Crime and Corruption Committee and various other hats that he's worn over the years. But let me just say a special welcome along to you, Mark Robinson.
Thank you, Neil. Great to be on your program.
Well, Mark, a good day to have you in because right now today, let's just be Queensland-centric for a few moments here because the Queensland Premier announced a huge plan, and the criticisms, of course, are that he's buying a lot of votes, and Queenslanders, particularly around southeast Queensland, so you're talking Brisbane, the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast, 50-cent fares when you get on a train or a bus or a ferry. It sounds like a great policy, doesn't it, to make things happen? I wonder, how does this affect you in your electorate? What have people been saying?
Well, look, I think in a cost of living crisis, people appreciate that government should be doing more to help them. However, this is a trial. It's something that I'm getting various feedback about. The people on North Stradbroke Island, for example, in my electorate, the ferries are not 50 cents. So they're a little bit mixed feelings, a few upset that it doesn't apply across the board. It's been a bit selective. So, look, it's a trial, and I think David Crisafulli has made a commitment that, of course, it goes beyond the election, and should he be the next Premier, that, of course, we'll evaluate the trial and see how effective it was.
Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that if you are a regular user of public transport and you might be spending, $20, $30, $50 a week getting you to and from work, and all of a sudden 50-cent fares, you're going to feel pretty good about that. But I wonder whether you've got any thoughts around the thought of democracy. And there is, some philosophical foundation that says that once governments have to blatantly buy votes, it puts us at a particular place in cycles. And the buying of votes, there might be some ethics we could even talk about around that. But this does appear to be a vote-buying exercise, doesn't it, from the Queensland government?
Yeah, look, a lot of people are seeing it in that light as well, and are concerned about whether the budget can really afford these kinds of things, as opposed to focusing on other cost of living areas like lowering power prices. Our wholesale power price is very high. It's, I'm told, the highest in the nation. And yes, there's a bit of a hand back going of your own taxpayer money back to you, but there's a better way forward in terms of bringing cost of living relief pressures that other people are under in terms of high rentals, access to buying a first home. Some of these areas of cost of living, the cost of groceries, all of these and inflationary pressures are really hitting family budgets, and people are struggling.
It's interesting to talk about vote-buying exercises because when you mention energy prices, because while all Australians are experiencing a $300 boost, and I think it's $325 for people who are in business, but $300 boost around the nation coming off power bills. But in the state of Queensland, with Queensland election coming, you've got the Premier here offering or promising or delivering $1,000. That's additional to that $300 federally. Another really, I guess, blatant vote-buying exercise that you can't help but think, well, we're going to be, getting some sort of benefit here. The downside is, of course, as you say, that some of these things are not permanent. They are just around an election season. That's challenging, isn't it, when you're in opposition?
Well, look, people are interpreting it as a sugar hit, and economists as irresponsible. When we look at what the needs are of the economy, what the needs of running careful budgets and carefully targeting government resources into areas of need. So certainly, people are concerned about the short-term nature of it, the fact that it suddenly has happened in the lead up to an election, which I think across the nation, people are wise up to these things and realise that sometimes governments under pressure come up with a magical tree budget at election time. And so I do understand people being cynical about it as well. And I'm hearing a lot of that in my electorate out in the Redlands area, Cleveland centred electorate of mine. A lot of people are concerned that that the government does a better job with the economy so that in the future, they can live a more prosperous life.
Some will say, well, how does a government afford to buy votes on this scale? And is there an issue here around the Queensland Labor government's policies around taxing mining companies, just higher taxation levels of royalties or rent tax, or however you frame that, because there's been a huge windfall, hasn't there? Because the Queensland Labor government has decided to tax mining companies.
Yes, I think initially the government said, and the incoming treasurer had said there'd be no new taxes and higher taxes. And what we've actually seen is the opposite. We've seen a lot of new taxes, and we've seen a dramatic increase in some of the areas of like royalties and the royalties on the mining industry. The problem is, if you kill the goose that lays the golden egg, you impact on a lot of communities and the general state of the economy. And I think a lot of jobs have been put at risk, and I have family that live up in central Queensland around Rockhampton, and we've lived in Townsville. We know what it's like to live in a regional centre that can sometimes have very important industries around it where they can't just jump from one industry to another easily. And, while there may be in the inner cities concerns about, coal going forward, the reality is, the jobs that are generated from the coal industry and the wealth that's created as part of a broader mix of energy going forward is still important to our nation and to Queensland. And so this, putting this industry at huge risk for the short-term gains of just clinging onto power is what it looks like, and it's what a lot of people are calling it out as.
We're in the deep end early in our conversation here, Mark, but is there an issue of morality that as a Christian you can look at the ways that perhaps a progressive government is treating the taxation, the assets, the resources of a state, compared to the way that someone on a conservative side might actually think of how you deal with the resources and delivering the services that a state government ought to deliver?
Well, of course, state governments have to collect enough revenue to be able to run their services and build the infrastructure they're responsible for. I've always been a believer in leaving money in other people's pockets. And even though over the last 15 years I've been a member of Parliament, my view has been that government should stay small and should tax the least that it has to, and run the services it needs. It needs to be able to run services well, but there's been a lot of money wasted. When we look at Wellcamp and $220 million wasted there, we look at the billions of dollars of overspend because of some of the CFMEU sites where they've pressed for this best practice that's cost the government a whole lot more to run projects and build projects. There are areas where, we can do better and keep government to a reasonable size, that it's not overtaxing people who are already doing it tough.
Well, I mentioned, Mark, that you are, and I said, I'm not sure whether this is the right terminology, retiring, certainly retiring from your seat at this upcoming Queensland state election. And it's been I think that's something like, is it 15 years in the Queensland Parliament? And when you're reflecting on that 15 years, majority of that has been spent in opposition. It's been a tough road for opposition parties. How do you reflect on that 15 years?
Well, look, whether in opposition or government, I've always found my role is to fight for a fair share for my local electorate and the region in which I live, within a fair context across the whole state and what's reasonable. So we've, those 15 years, yes, largely in opposition. It just means you have to fight harder, you have to press your case harder, and that's just really been part of what we've needed to do. But it's been a great honour for 15 years to serve in the state parliament and to serve the people of the Cleveland electorate, now renamed as Oodgeroo, and beyond, in opportunities that I've had as the deputy Speaker of the Parliament when we were in government for that one term, and also as a shadow minister for main roads, fisheries, marine infrastructure. And they were amazing opportunities. And as you said, I've sat on a number of committees as well, which has really helped me to see a lot of our state and the amazing people and communities around Queensland and our nation.
And special honour to you too, over that time where you've not been afraid to wear your Christian faith and values loud and proud out there in the front line of where you have debated and where you've had to deliberate on various things. How do you reflect on that 15 years in the Parliament? What it was like 15 years ago to be a Christian in the Parliament, and whether there's been a bit of a deterioration in the way that people are happy to come forward and to loudly and proudly proclaim their faith positions on these things. It seems to me that people are often a little bit hesitant to be able to claim a Christian values base. You've maintained that, but how do you reflect on 15 years? Is there a change?
I definitely think it's become much harder to identify as a person of faith, in my case as a Christian and particularly as a pastor, and to, I'd have to say some sections of the media are quite intolerant to having traditional, old-fashioned, whatever you want to call them, Judeo-Christian values that actually are timeless as opposed to being one particular generation or old-fashioned. And I think those basic family values, the faith, the place of faith in our society, the freedoms around that, I think they are all under a terrible assault by left ideology. I'll say it's broader than any one political party. It's probably worse in some states than others and some parties than others. But there definitely is a significant change in attitudes of some elite in the media, some left in the media. There's a significant weaponising against people who have a faith. And that's why I think we really do need a religious protection bill nationally. And we need to see, I think, a different approach to how discrimination legislation, and some even under good intentions of human rights, some of that legislation and some of that direction is being weaponised against people of faith to silence them in the marketplace, silence them at work, silence them in the media, and I worry for the future of that.
Well, you're no stranger to being called names and, things like ultra-conservative, extremist. Maybe you've been called worse names than those, but when you're labelled like that, is it the labelling that compartmentalises people and therefore they want to break free from being compartmentalised? Does it restrict you from doing your job effectively as a state member representative for your electorate? Is it restrictive to actually be compartmentalised, or is it actually freeing?
Well, look, I think identity politics is becoming an unfortunate trend that is, and I use the word weaponised. I think being a person of faith is something that the freedoms that are being taken away, or in the way that people are approaching people of faith, and if you like, I found people put you in a box. They put you in you're a Christian. What they don't know is my story is growing up as a non-religious person as an atheist, studying science in my university years and coming to an appreciation of faith and revelation of faith and adopting Christian faith and becoming a Christian leader. And they don't understand your story. And I think it's a pity. I don't ever claim any victimhood status around that. I think that lacks an integrity, that everyone's a victim because somebody focuses on something and calls you ultra this or that. I think it's a pity that people are trying to shift general family values into the ultra-conservative as opposed to quite a central normative feature of Australian life still today. So I think these people, there's some very deliberate targeting and very deliberate campaigning. I mean, in my last election campaign, to have Get Up, to have anti-Christian groups, if you say pro-abortion groups, target me, single me out. Again, it's water off a duck's back if you don't let those things get to you. But sometimes, unfortunately, it does impact on people. And I can think of numbers of Christian members of Parliament around our nation present, and others that are in different roles that are being targeted by various groups. And I think that's really sad. Ultimately, though, freedom of speech within a fair, and reasonable frame is there, and we should maintain that. So you should be up for criticism for valid reasons, but the attacks that are happening on people of faith just simply for their faith is on the increase, and it's disturbing.
If we're just picking up on those things that we were talking about in that last segment, Mark, the thought that there is a shifting of family values to be aligned with extremism, that would be a concern for moving forward, because we want to stand for some traditional family values, and we'll say they're Christian values. But if those are made out to be extremist values, then somehow or other people are standoffish. Is that what you've found?
Yes, well, I have found that, and I think thinking of, there's many different types of families, and people have there's a lot of flexibility about what family is today. But I think when we see issues like parental rights being removed deliberately through legislation, where the right to be aware of what's going on, and I don't want to particularly pick on any community, but one example is some of the difficulties with gender confusion and what's happening there. And when you look at the fact that at some schools, parents are not advised if the school has picked up on this matter, if a child has raised an issue at school and the parents are not involved in the loop, and so medical advice and psychiatric advice is sought, and some significant decisions, for example, taking a medical course of approach with puberty blockers or things like that just to young, confused children. I think that's a great concern. The issue itself for children is the impact on children, but then also that parents aren't even part of the process yet. When my children who've been at school have, at the sick bay, you've needed to give parental permission just for there to be Panadol should they come to the sick bay with a bad headache. So I think that's just one example of the undermining of parental rights, and I think that's on the increase, and that's a concern. I think in most families, parents know what's best for their children.
All these gender issues certainly been highlighted by what we've seen coming out of the Paris Games. I know that there has been a push for some state or territory somewhere in Australia to have some form of independent inquiry into how you might just bring a little bit of truth and reality into the issues around gender. Is this sort of discussion going on in the LNP in Queensland? What would listeners take away from a thought here so far as an election coming?
Well, look, I think they're generally coming up on a regular basis as things happen. Like you've said, the Olympics has brought that that situation to the forefront with the incident with the boxers. And, while it's always good to be fully aware of all of the science behind and the medical side behind that and the mental health aspects of that before we jump in, there's two individuals involved there. But at the same time, we need to be careful, for example, that women feel that they can go into, female-friendly spaces, that they can compete at a fair level, not be hurt, not be injured, that there are female spaces that are, when we think of women's base rights, I think that's important that we protect that space. And it's interesting the different people who've come to me over time and said, it's not just the Christian community, it's the general community. In fact, for example, I've had people who say that they are openly gay or lesbian come to me and say, I'm really concerned that this sense of the fluidity of it all is not something they actually agree with and believe in themselves. So there's a lot in this. We've got to be very careful about how we go forward with some of these things.
We may talk some more about that. Let's squeeze in a call before news. 1-800 316 316. Our talkback line's open. Let's take a call. Vince is in Brisbane. Hello, Vince. Welcome.
Yeah. Hi, Neil. Look, just a minute. First, quickly, I was intrigued, to hear that he was once an atheist and a science teacher, and then came to embrace Christianity. But the big point I want to make is how, he might be labelled an ultra-conservative Christian, but now in this dystopia where we live in, he's labelled as an extremist, whereas, say, in America, the likes like radical left groups like Antifa, that burn buildings and carry on with their extremist anarchist ideology, the media either downplays it or simply says they don't exist. Or
Vince, you made a good point there, and I don't have much time to get a quick thought here, but that's a very good point, isn't it? Those who are labelling those Christian family values as extreme, they've got a very extreme agenda and actions on their side. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, absolutely. Vince, and absolutely they are weaponising terms to try to shift the debate and shift people's views about what's extremist. I was down in Victoria recently, not long ago, and there was an inquiry about extremism, and I saw some fairly normal forms of Christianity in people's sights under what we would generally think of as just good members of a faith community, and very disturbing when you see those sort of trends and people driving that.
Mark, before we move on, and we'll take some calls in just a few moments, one of those big glaring examples of those things that are being manoeuvred into an extremist category, and some have drawn attention to the significant issues that are going on right now post the Wyambilla shootings or the Wyambilla massacres, and characterised as a religiously motivated terrorist attack in Australia, and it's considered to be a Christian terrorist attack when people talk about this sort of thing. That would be probably more an extreme example, wouldn't it, of Christian values being swept into an extremist category?
Look, absolutely, Neil, and your caller raised issues of extremism, and that was an incredibly tragic event of those officers that were killed, the neighbour that was killed. We've seen in that the amazing response of the police officers of the day, and more coming to light of their bravery and certainly correctly labelled as religious extremism. And we really do need to understand better how these sorts of radical thinking comes about in order to prevent further incidents like this. But I was a little disturbed as a side that it was blamed on Christianity, it was blamed as Christian, yet there's nothing Christian about really what those people did. I mean, it's the if you follow the life of Christ, who's a peacemaker, the solution to everything is through peace. And I think, to me, it is a case of disturbing religious extremism, but I think wrongly labelled. Certainly not the Christianity, the Christ, the Christian community that I know and that I've worked with for 39 years now as a pastor as well around this nation in various places. And I had some conversations with police about that as well, and I think mostly they understood that difference. And so I think that's those initial reports of Christian extremism as opposed to religious extremism, I think have been addressed to some degree, but an incredibly tragic event.
And there's a lot of evidence coming out now, a lot of witnesses being called to, I think, is an inquest around that whole issue of the Wiambilla shootings, and cautionary about how you hear of Christianity being characterised by that. As you say, there is a cautionary place there, because everyone listening will know thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder is one of the 10 Commandments. And that's one of those issues as Christians we would hold very dearly to. And when something goes outside of that boundary, then we look for other reasons why that might have happened. So it's not a right thing to characterise that as a way of a Christian attack or a Christian terrorism. There's a cautionary tale to tell when you say be careful here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think understanding that if your faith does not lead you to become a more peaceful person, then you need to question your faith. If your faith is not leading to you becoming a more generous, compassionate, kinder person, then you should be asking questions about what you're being taught.
Okay, well, let's move on. Let's take a call. Another listener who's called in, 1-800-316-316, to join in our conversation today. We're talking faith and politics. Harry is in Innisfail in North Queensland. Hey, Harry, welcome along.
Thank you very much, and nice to meet you, Mark, and all the best for your retirement, of course. Concerning the extremist type of legislation that's floating around now, that, around the family, that sort of thing, that you've sort of touched on. Mark, were you in the Parliament, I assume the Queensland State Parliament, I beg your pardon?
Yes, I'm in the Queensland Parliament, Harry, yep.
Yeah, sorry about that, Mark.
You're right.
Yeah, so were you present there when people had to, the MPs had to vote on coercive control?
There has been legislation to do with domestic violence and coercive control, yes.
Okay, so can I just ask you why you ticked the yes box on specifically coercive control?
Look, I think there's been a series of legislation over a period of time, and more recently the government brought in legislation. I think it's been an area that for some time dealing with coercion, and that's across a whole range of areas. It's sometimes quite a complex area of law, I'm told by the lawyers. I'm not a lawyer myself, but appreciating that there are some behaviours that end up being coercive to the point where they have a terrible impact on people, especially within the domestic violence setting. And we've seen some terrible tragedies that have happened as a result in Queensland and in other states of people who have coerced and have been in the middle of a domestic and family violence context. That and also it plays out within obviously between where there's sexual violence, and there's certainly a very important changes that are happening in that space across Australia, and I'm generally very supportive. Of course, I think you always have to see what's the detail. These are complex matters of law, and you want to make sure there aren't unintended consequences. So having said that, I think it's important that state legislation and federal legislation continues to be up to date to ensure we don't see repeats and we see some change happen.
Harry, anything further to add?
Yes, just specifically on the coercive control legislation, which, the research that's floating around publicly, and the research I've done, but other people also, is that there is actually no relationship in Australia, between a man and a woman predominantly, but it could be in the gay community as well. But there's no actual relationship in Australia that, if coercive control legislation as it is submitted or analysed on the grounds of that legislation, there's not one relationship that can withstand it. Coercive control is, as the legislation stands, and the public needs to be aware that there is not one relationship that, even under,
Harry, I think we can hear what you're saying here. In fact, coercive control, almost a very loose terminology, could be applied to a whole lot of different things. And no doubt there are special contexts in which the legislation hopefully has detail around. But any final thought here for Harry?
Look, I just think it's an issue that needs to continue to be looked at to reduce and hopefully eliminate those sorts of coercion. Some people should not be coerced in a whole range of important decisions in their own life. And of course, people may have strong views. You can have robust discussions. All of those things can be done. But to coerce somebody into something, especially in a manipulative way that could bring harm to them, obviously our laws need to protect people from that.
Let's take another call, 1-800-316 316. Let's welcome Hayley, who is in Perth, WA. Hello, Hayley.
Hello, good morning. Thanks very much for having me on.
What are your thoughts?
Just a very high level, one of the aims of the globalist agenda is to eradicate Christianity and the pride that we have in our values. They are using, and have been for a long time now, for a few decades, conquer and divide to bring a new type of world order. The West is being diluted and destroyed. Unfortunately, and this has got nothing to do with racism because we shouldn't be seeing colour, but it is being destroyed by unvetted mass immigration of cultures, unfortunately, and it is sad, but they do not assimilate. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the UK. And there is two-tier politics and policing to silence the indigenous British population and European as well, while supporting, defending the criminal elements. And most of these are fighting-age men who hate the West.
Hayley, you're making some good points here. I think you're talking about immigration and the fact that not everybody integrates so well, and there's all sorts of challenges from that. And sometimes that's a federal issue, but it also is something for the states. From your perspective, Mark, how do you deal with those sorts of questions?
Yeah, look, just at least first dealing with just some of the issues around the globalism. Look, there's a lot of currents and forces. There's a lot of trends and things that happen and pressures around the world in terms of what does multiculturalism look like in various countries, what does people reevaluating Western society, colonialism. There's a lot of big things like that. But as we look at how it plays out here in Queensland and how it plays out probably in Western Australia similarly, we are very blessed as a nation to have so many migrant communities people have immigrated over a long period of time to Australia and made Australia their home. And I think of them today as bicultural Australians. Some are first generation, second, third generation, and making an amazing contribution to our nation that is changing and positively changing. At the same time, we do have to be aware of, for example, at the moment, federally playing out the scale of that immigration. We've got a cost of living crisis and housing crisis, and always government has to be very aware of at what pace we can absorb or welcome new people that come, and ensure that they're coming to good employment opportunities, good housing opportunities. They're not coming to a second-rate Western circumstance for them. So it's always a balancing act doing that. I think there are concerns about, under the banner of a big Australia, about immigration happening too quickly. We've certainly taken on a lot at the moment, and I know federally the Liberal National Party's approach has been, or concerns are probably echoing the concerns of the wider community of being careful about that pace, at the same time being very welcoming of people who come and make a wonderful contribution to our nation. And there's a balance in all of that. Of course, we want people to come through the proper channels. We want them to come through proper immigration processing rather than come by boat. And we've seen the risk and what happens when we've had this almost open border policy that previously, where thousands of people came and hundreds died at sea. And I think, images of some of those people dying, in boats that were smashed on rocks, I think that's, I'm hoping those days are gone. But we're seeing a few signs that are worrying of that whole industry of people smuggling starting up again. So I think we've got to be very careful. It's a switch you can switch on, and it's very hard to switch off. So certainly my role as Assistant Shadow Minister here in Queensland for multicultural communities and for international student education has been to work with our multicultural communities here in Brisbane, particularly the southeast and across the state and nation. And that's been an incredible honour for me to see some of the all of the families that I meet. My background too in multiculturalism as involved in aid and development and back and forward into Southeast Asia, and my PhD, my Masters and PhD in International and Asian Studies has certainly given me a great appreciation of cultural variety and the strengths that different cultures have. So, I believe we just need to be careful how we shape that for our future and for those that come. And continue to be a welcoming country, and that's a fine balance. That's not easy.
Hayley in Perth, thank you so much for your call. Let's take another call. Richard is in Alstonville in New South Wales. Hey, Richard, welcome.
G'day, guys. Got a couple of quick questions for you. I just one from a political and faith Christian point of view. When they talk about left and right, is there anywhere in the Bible, because you hear, you got the ultra-left in politics and the right conservative and Christian stuff, is there anywhere in the Bible that would link the right side being more towards Christianity from a political standpoint? Okay,
this brings us into a philosophical conversation here, and I often will say you've got left and right, and then in a separate sense you've got what's Christian. But I'm interested in your thoughts here, Mark.
Well, if you frame up left and right as the traditional political approach of left being more socialist and right being more conservative, I think sometimes it's hard to frame the Bible into left or right. So, for example, if you're talking about helping the disadvantaged, somebody that needs a house, is that something that the left should do, the right should do? For me, my Christian values are that I put an additional value on helping those who have a disadvantage, for those who are, I call them the little people, the people who don't have a way to resolve their situation. They need help. Life has beaten up on them. That may be housing, it may be they've been an addict who's trying to break free and get a better life. I think that's where Christian people should be at the absolute forefront of that, and Christian politicians should be there. Now, sometimes it's a handout, sometimes it's hopefully more of a hand up and help them get on their own 2 feet. But I think, is that left or right? Sometimes I may have been seen as a bit more left in my social policy on the area of compassion and helping the needy. Yet at the same time, I'm certainly seen as a Christian conservative in the right. So, how do you frame things? It's not always easy. The Bible doesn't set out to in my view, it doesn't seem to set out to separate too much into, the left and the right. It's more of a political construct, I would say.
Is it fair enough to say, though, that when one side takes a particularly drastic move towards abortion law or the euthanasia laws, that there would be a Christian position that says, our values certainly lean one way or another? But then that puts the Conservatives to the test, doesn't it, to be able to actually take a truly conservative position?
Well, look, I think most people that would call themselves Christian conservative as politicians on many of those social issues would be seen as in the right, as in they would, be pro-life, they would be against euthanasia. They tend to be, and this is a more controversial one, well, the others are too, but they tend to believe that a definition of marriage is between a man and a woman, yet they understand and accept that the law allows for gay couples to form a relationship and have rights under the law. Whether you call that a civil union or some other name, today it is in the law called marriage. Many Christians just don't describe it that way. They're not being phobic. They're not being anti-gay. They're just saying it's a definition that's thousands and thousands of years universally. It's been a definition of a kind of relationship that is male and female. If you want it to be a degendered way of describing relationships, they don't call that marriage, yet the law calls it that. And I think that's going to be a very interesting thing going forward, that something like at least 38%, 40%, and in my estimation, it's probably around 50% or more of people actually still don't think of that form of relationship as actually a marriage, and yet they're not phobic haters. They're people that are very good people.
Very quickly, Richard in Alstonville, you had an extra question. What were your thoughts, or what more do you like to add?
I had another question about taxation and finance. Do you agree with the fact, because I don't know how long it's been like this in Australian politics, but you have both the ATO at a federal level, at Treasury and the ATO taxation, and then you have state revenue. Do you think state revenue is a good idea for governments, or should we all have it at a federal level?
Well, I think in whatever you've got three levels of government, they all have to have a form of revenue, and the federal government through income tax and other forms of taxation. State levels, tends to be charges and levies and fees and other forms of stamp duties and now massively coal royalties. But they all have to have a form of revenue earning in order to, in a state sense, states are largely responsible for service delivery and infrastructure. So you need to have a basis for which to have, your income in order to, build projects and, provide services and schooling and things like that.
Richard in Alstonville, thank you so much for your call. We'll have to put a line under any other calls. Just a few minutes remaining for our conversation. I wonder whether you've got any thoughts here, because some people will say in the state of Queensland around all sorts of things, whether it's abortion laws or termination procedures and in public hospitals, the euthanasia laws, the gender indoctrination, whether there is a repeal appetite on the LNP side of politics. Are there plans to repeal? Just thinking of what happened in New Zealand when there was a change of government in New Zealand, and the new Luxon government just repealed all of the very significant left-wing policies of the former Ardern government. Is there some sort of issue? Does what happens in discussions on the LNP side? How will you change some of these things that a lot of Christians will describe as dreadful laws?
Well, I think, Neil, firstly, let me say I'm retiring.
No, that's why I'm asking your opinion here.
And so I won't be part of the next government going forward, and I hope it will be an LNP government. I think the current government has lost its way, and it's. I think priorities is a very big issue, and I do think on a lot of the social issues they've had the wrong priorities. And so I take, for example, maternity services versus increasing late-term abortion. Instead of focusing more on providing better maternity services, and you can go to numbers of parts of Queensland where whole maternity units are being closed. So instead of focusing on that, recently the state Labor government brought in a broad maternity bill that included some amendments to the Termination Act to make abortion even more available than what it currently is. It's completely liberalised right up until birth, and then now they changed the legislation so that the RU486, the abortion drug, could be distributed by someone of lesser medical standing than a doctor. So in order for that to be made even more available, and you look at that and you say, where's the priorities with that? Maternity services being closed, even maternity services coming under pressure where I am in the Redlands, at both Redlands Hospital and with the closure of the maternity section at the private Mater Hospital there at Redlands, which is something that myself and a number of the candidates have been working hard. We've been trying to prevent that and find some way to not have a reduction of those services. So I think what I'm saying is what you focus on and what your priorities are really critical. This election, the priorities will be on the major crises that are there in terms of cost of living, youth crime, housing, health and hospitals. I think they're the four big things that this election will swing on, and I really hope it will be an LNP government. Of course, I'm an LNP member, and I've worked within the party for some 16 years, came in just before I ran, and I see our values as very firmly anchored in family values. And I look at when I go to State Council, and while I can't talk about the fine detail of some of that, our policies are very much a broad suite of family values. And so I think that as we go forward, I think people would expect that those whatever the future government faces, if it's an LNP government, whatever comes up in that time, it would need to reference it back to what those family policies of the party and the general expectation of Queenslanders are. And that's how I think it will be framed. But what comes up and I don't know of any great agenda of repeal. I'm not aware of anything in that space, but I do think that there are no doubt corrections that will happen over time. But look, that's a broad statement, and I won't be in the government, so I'm not a spokesperson for the leader, David Crisafulli, who I have a very high regard for. I actually think he's one of the finest political leaders that I've worked with.
And no doubt listeners will be hearing your heartbeat on that, and with an expectation too, I suspect, that so many of Queensland's voters will be expecting to see a real contrast between Labor and the LNP ahead of the election. Wonderful to get your insights today, Dr. Mark Robinson, and a 15-year career, retiring at the upcoming Queensland election. Former Senator Amanda Stoker is the endorsed candidate in your seat of Oodgeroo, and we'll no doubt get an opportunity perhaps sometime soon to have Amanda Stoker on, and she might be able to shed some light on some of these things if she is to be a part of the next Queensland government. But Mark Robinson, I want to thank you so much for taking some time to share these thoughts and your heart around faith and politics with listeners today on 2020.
Oh, thank you, Neil, and to your listeners, thank you for listening.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.